Hi, welcome to session three of the sixth topic of the semester, from Civil Wars to Reconstruction, 1860 to 1877. Now, this is session three, and now we're going to look at Reconstruction. In the first and second sessions, we were looking at the origins of the Civil War. We examined that quite extensively, looking at sectionalism, economic, systems that developed very differently in the North and the South. The Industrial Revolution that took place in the North also was a dividing issue because the South did not industrialize and became increasingly dependent on cotton agriculture. And again, we're going to see the rise of two different regions that entered into competition by the 1830s. And of course, the abolitionist movement growing up in the North was also dividing the nation. The insistence of Northerners, religious organizations to do away with slavery was also a dividing factor as well. And likewise, again, we also saw the emergence of political parties that are going to also split the nation geographically in half, between a democratic South that supported slavery and the way of life of the South, and of course, the Republican North that represented the views, again, of Northerners in industrialization, modernization, wage labor, particularly, and a consumer economy, which they believed required the abolition of slavery, of course. So again, those sections really moved into a breaking point with the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, the Republican candidate. That campaign with the slogan, with the promise of bringing the end to slavery. And with that, of course, we saw the process of secession itself, the South seceding from the Union in 1860. So we were looking also again at the process of the Civil War, looking at particularly at Texas itself. This is something that we examined in session two, how during the Civil War, again, Texas is going to participate, is going to come at the very end of this process of secession, joining the Confederacy, one of the last states that did so. It was reluctant. Again, within Texas, there were forces that wanted to remain part of the Union. There were Democrats, the Union Democrats. There were others that favored industrialization, like the Whigs as well. So they favored also the Union. There were German immigrants that also favored the Union. And there were the Northerners, again, people living in around Dallas, for example, Fort Worth area that migrated from the Ohio Valley from the north in previous years. They were also sympathetic to the Northern cause. And there were, of course, Western settlers as well in Texas that also did not want to secede. Despite the fact that there was opposition, there's going to be a great motion to push Texas out of the Union by the fire eaters. They were called the secessionists, the Democrats that wanted secession. Even the governor, Sam Houston, again, did not want to secede. He was a strong unionist. But again, he reluctantly allowed the process of secession just because there was a strong motion, again, within the Democratic Party to do so. And again, that dragged Texas to, again, the Confederacy. And so we were looking at that again in session two and some of the problems that Texas went through. For example, the forts, the military garrisons were abandoned by the federal soldiers. So Texas was totally unprotected throughout the war. We're going to see the Indian War once again coming into being. The Comanches are raiding the Western settlements. There's also fighting with the Kickapoo. And there's going to be, again, a great battle, not only with the Union Army. Texas is not just concerned about the Union Army, but also about, again, the indigenous groups that are resilient, that are still not, cooperating, if you will, with Texas. They're defending their territory, and there's going to be a great struggle there. You also saw again an alliance between Texas and France, and of course it was just not just Texas; it was the entire Confederacy was allied with France because France had come to Mexico. It intervened in the Mexican Civil War of the 1850s, and by 1861, France occupies again Mexico and turns Mexico into a colony, and used Mexico, if you will, as a launching pad for sending materials, war materials, particularly into the Confederacy, particularly Texas, in return for cotton. Again, the cotton diplomacy, as it was called, the Southerners were depending on the cotton exports to finance the war, and they depended upon, again, selling this cotton or trading the cotton to with the French in return for war supplies and the like. Again, so we also saw that again as essential again in this process. So ultimately, again, Texas is going to again surrender because again it was financially very unstable. It was unable to raise taxes. It was taxing people by force, seizing property and animals and the like. There was great violence within Texas as well. There were thieves and bandits and so on. It was a state of anarchy. A lot of plundering going on as well. And again, Texas is just again unable to pacify the region, and it started to print money to pay for expenses. So that led to inflation, likewise, and of course, great numbers of soldiers are deserting from the Confederate ranks as well. There's a lot of soldiers that are not fighting again for Texas just because they don't feel a connection to the Texas cause. So again, that brought the end again of the war itself. Now we're going to be moving now to Reconstruction. So let me share here the outline, so we can continue now looking into Reconstruction. So I always offer a very brief introduction of what we cover so far. So students who are watching again individual slides can at least know what has been discussed previously, so they can connect again the information that was lectured before with the present slide, with this present session. So again, now we're moving into Reconstruction. Again, the process by which the United States is going to rebuild the South and bring it back into the Union. So again, there's going to be a reunification, so to speak, of the Union. But that required, again, changing the South. The South cannot be simply admitted back into the Union as it was. The South has to meet certain changes. It has to change. It has to reform certain practices, certain institutions, in order to be ready, in order to meet the conditions, again, of the North. In this case, the political party that rules the North at this point is the Republican Party. And many Northerners agree that the South has to reform before they can be readmitted, okay, back into the country. So this is the process of Reconstruction is going to unfold, roughly speaking, even before the end of the war in 1865. Around 1863, at midpoint, we're going to see the beginning stages of Reconstruction. This begins around 1863, and this is a process that will continue all the way to 1877. By 1877, this process was completed. The readmission of the southern states, again, was completed. How much change the South went through, how much reform, how much Southern society is going to change, well, I mean, that's subject to debate. But by 1877, we see the complete reunification of the country, okay? So this is what we're going to be doing today, again, in this particular session. And the best way to understand Reconstruction is by understanding the different stages of Reconstruction, the different phases. Reconstruction went through three particular phases or stages, okay? And it is a very good way to organize the material, to understand the timeline, and to understand how this process unfolded step by step. And within this process, we are going to be paying attention to Texas itself. Of course, this is something that all the ex-Confederate states are going through, but Texas was unique in that there were unique circumstances, unique changes taking place in Texas, and our focus of attention will be primarily Texas in this study of Reconstruction. Okay, so the first stage of Reconstruction is what historians call wartime Reconstruction. Okay, wartime Reconstruction. Again, in the last 2 years of the Civil War, as I mentioned, the process of Reconstruction began. It was during wartime. In other words, Reconstruction did not begin when the South, the Confederacy, surrendered, but rather it was when there were clear signs that the South was going to be defeated. In other words, by 1863, now the scale was tilting in favor of the Union of the North. And there were very clear signs that the South was going to lose because they were losing major battles. Their infrastructure was being shattered, something that I explained in session 2. Their railroads, there was great destruction of railroads as well. They were facing bankruptcies, financial problems, many of those Southern Confederate states as well, food shortages as well. There was a very limited supply of foodstuffs. And it was a matter of time. So because it was just a matter of time when the South was going to call quits, the Union began to now move forward and initiate the first stages, the first baby steps to try to rebuild the South as early as 1863. So the first phase of Reconstruction is called wartime Reconstruction. And it spanned for about a year and a half or so between 1863 and 1865. Now let us look at that. Again, what is this a first stage of Reconstruction during wartime? So the first stage of Reconstruction began when President Lincoln saw it necessary to do away with a very great assets that the Confederacy used to conduct the war, and that is the system of labor itself, and so slavery, in other words. So if the Confederacy did not have this system of labor at their disposal, they were not going to be building forts or mining coal or growing food. This is what the slaves were doing for the Confederacy, helping through their labor the Confederate war effort indirectly. Again, I mean, this is an indirect way of helping. Again, so what President Lincoln wanted was to simply, again, as a strategy, as a wartime strategy, was simply, again, emancipate the slaves. Again, so it issued a presidential order to the Union generals fighting in the South called the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, giving them an order that now they had to, besides confronting the Confederacy, besides engaging the Confederacy and winning battles, is that their mission was also to free the slaves, again, wherever they go. Again, to take away, the system of labor. It's about 4 million slaves or plus, again, that were to be liberated. Now, this is not going to happen overnight. The Union generals will have to go from place to place, from state to state, from plantation to plantation, in order to be liberating the slaves. But again, this really started the process of Reconstruction, is that, we need to abolish slavery. And during wartime, it just made sense from a strategic, practical point, is that if we are going to abolish slavery, let's start doing it now. So to accelerate, the defeat, the defeat of the Confederacy, okay, to speed it up, in other words. Okay, so it came out as a sort of practical matter, if you will, the Emancipation Proclamation. This is the beginning stages for the end of slavery, that is to say, the beginning stages. Now, during wartime Reconstruction, we're going to see a group of Republicans This is the party of Lincoln. This is the party of the North that are representing the Union, again, that are in control of the Union forces. And they, of course, they control Congress as well. And we're going to see that within the Republican Party, we're going to see the rise of a minority group. It started out as a minority group, by the way, known as the Radical Republicans. Okay, they were known as the Radical Republicans because they believed that the objectives, the goals of the Civil War needed to go way beyond simply abolishing slavery and freeing the slaves. That was just the first step. They wanted radical change to take place in the South, not just ending slavery, but rather, they really wanted to do away with slavery, and after the slaves were freed, to integrate them into the national life. In other words, so they be granted citizenship, okay, and so they can enjoy all the guarantees, all the rights of the Constitution as well, and to also integrate them into the economic and national life of the country. Okay, so education, for example, was essential for them, building public schools, etc., to educate the freed population, and also to grant them the right to vote. So they can vote as well, so they can participate in elections, participate in the political process as well. They also wanted land distribution. They wanted to grant land to families in single individuals, 40 acres, they will say, 40 acres and a mule. Let me just write it here, okay? 40 acres and a mule. In other words, that so they could become economically independent, they needed to be given land, in other words, because if you just free them, in other words, and if you don't educate them, if you don't give them the means, the tools, so they can actually become self-reliant, economically speaking, what they're going to do is simply just go back to the plantation, and work for their former masters, not as a slave anymore, but for a wage. And that's all they're going to be doing is just, again, they're going to be, involved in agricultural labor. So, working for a landowner, working for a plantation owner, etc. So the Radical Republicans really wanted radical change to take place, to uplift, in other words, the freed population, so they could participate in the life of the nation. Okay, so they could participate again in the economic life of the country, political life, etc., and so on and so forth. Okay, and their vision of the future, okay, is that their vision of the future for the United States is that they really saw the process of Reconstruction and the Civil War itself as an opportunity for the United States to create a new type of society, okay, a new society. So because they were coming from the Second Great Awakening, again, from the 1830s and 40s, they're part of this generation that I was talking about, again, the Great Revivalist movement. They were abolitionists. The leaders of the Radical Republicans, of course, like Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner, were deeply religious, by the way. Thaddeus Stevens he was from Pennsylvania, and Charles Sumner was from Massachusetts. So they're deeply religious. One is from Pennsylvania, Quaker background, and Charles Sumner, of course, from Massachusetts, Puritan background, deeply religious, and they felt that they were born in a very critical time in U.S. history, precisely because they felt that they were sent by God into the United States, particularly in this time of peril, this time of crisis, in order to reshape, to give birth again to a new type of society in the United States. They call this society an interracial democracy. They said that their mission is, from the ashes of the Civil War, that they were simply going to build again a new type of democratic society. The United States was on its road to become a democracy. Of course, it was building a democracy. Of course, and Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner, the so-called radical Republicans, the leaders of the radical Republicans, believed that it was a destiny of the United States that it will become a great melting pot. In other words, they just looked around and said, "Look, this society is really diverse, ethnically, culturally, religiously, and so on. It's just so diverse that our ethnic differences or cultural differences are not really going to matter, because in the United States, our culture is a democratic culture in which we value democracy. We value individuals participating, again, in the life of the nation, making decisions, their voice being heard." And so ultimately what they said is that in the future, American democracy is destined to become a multiracial again democracy. That there will be so many different ethnic groups. Again, they said that we're all going to coexist, share the same spaces. We're all going to share spaces in schools and at the workplace, etc., all across the country. And those differences, again, that are superficial are not really going to matter, because we're all going to be really building our own future as a nation, as a country. That this is the opportunity, again, the Civil War and Reconstruction, to build, again, this interracial democracy. And of course, how this is going to come about, again, by making sure that besides freeing the slaves, we grant them civil rights. In other words, that they're granted citizenship status, okay, the citizenship, and as citizens to be also granted what is called voting rights, again, so they can, have the right to vote, so they can vote as well, okay. Also, the 40 acres and a mule, again, so they can become farmers, so they can work their own land, again, and not depend upon anything, so they don't work for anybody, and so on. Again, so again, this is a radical vision. This is a radical reform that they're proposing, that in the very beginning, their peers in Congress are not really going to go along immediately. In other words, it's just a minority of Republicans that are proposing so much change to take place in the South. But in the very beginning, during the wartime process, they're not going to have all of the support from their peers. Okay, so it is in 1864, a year before the war ended, that finally the Republicans agreed that part of the Reconstruction process was to abolish slavery in the Constitution. That as the war was nearing its end, that it was very essential that the United States abolish slavery before the end of the war. So by the time the Southern states surrender, that bringing them back into the Union is going to require that they comply, again, with the U.S. Constitution, that they also ratify the 13th Amendment and abolish slavery as well. That this is going to be a non-negotiable, in other words. If it is in the Constitution, if it is illegal in the Constitution to own slaves, so if you want to rejoin the Union, you have to also end slavery as well in your state. That is to say, so again, we are moving now quite rapidly in this direction. That slavery is being abolished now. Even before the end of the war, so the Emancipation Proclamation, the rise of the Radical Republicans, and now the 13th Amendment. And just about when the war was coming to an end, Republicans in Congress created an institution that is going to be stationed in the South, again, in the ex-Confederate states, for the purpose of enforcing the Emancipation Proclamation, the emancipation of slaves, to liberate them, to make sure that they're freed, and to protect the integrity, the physical integrity of the African slaves as well. And they're also going to be there to settle disputes between the former slaves, the freedmen, as they were called, and their former masters. Again, if there are any disputes, any pending debts, etc., between the former slave, in this case, the freed person, the freed individual, and the former master, that the Freedmen's Bureau is going to intervene. And the expectation is that it was going to intervene on behalf of the freed man, okay, of the freedman, in other words, not on the side of, again, the former master, okay. So this institution was seen as critical by the Republicans. This essential if we are to rebuild the South. We have to create an institution that is going to enforce, of course, the will of Congress, the will of the president, again, and that will be the Freemen's Bureau. So this is an institution that was created to exist for a limited period of time, for about a year, and it had to be renewed. Again, year by year, had to be renewed, by the way. This is not going to be a permanent, of course, agency, but rather subject for, renewal. And of course, we're going to see, of course, what kind of problems are going to take place, in the renewal process. All right, so that was the first stage or phase of Reconstruction. Is called wartime, the opening act again of Reconstruction. Now, the second stage of Reconstruction is called presidential Reconstruction. Again, is going to now move the attention towards the president, in terms of the president becoming more and more involved, the leader of Reconstruction. Okay. And this is the second stage. One is wartime and the stage of Reconstruction. And now we're, again, looking at presidential Reconstruction, something that spanned roughly between 1863 and 1867. Again, the president is going to now take the lead in Reconstruction in terms of trying to present proposals or reforms towards the South in order to bring back the South as quickly as possible. Okay. And it started with President Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln becomes the leader of Reconstruction again. He is, of course, the president of the United States during the Civil War. And as such, it was towards the end of his first term that Abraham Lincoln is going to suggest a plan, offer a plan to the South. And just to remind you, again, this is really before the end of the war itself. Abraham Lincoln creates or offers what is called the 10% plan, okay, for Southerners as a whole. So what is the 10% plan? Well, the 10% plan is simply an offer, that Lincoln issued to the Southern, to Southerners who were not in favor of secession. So we examined, for example, Texas. I just started out this session by mentioning that in Texas, there were groups that did not favor secession. Okay, so there were different sectors of Texas society. The German immigrants I mentioned, the people living in North Texas, West Texas, cattle ranchers, and the like. Again, Union Democrats, etc. Again, that did not agree with this decision. So Texas was not alone. in this predicament. It was in many of the states, again, in many of the Confederacy, in many of those Confederate states, we see the same situation. There was at the very least 10%, at the very least. Of course, it was very well known that there was more than 10%, but at the very least, there's 10% of the population of each state that wants to go back to the Union. They want to return. So what the 10% plan was is that Lincoln is simply offering, he's actually talking to this group of people, the Unionists, again, in the South, saying, I offer to you the opportunity to come back to the Union. So I'm actually speaking to you so you can seize this opportunity and meet in one of your cities in the state for the purpose of writing a new constitution that prohibits slavery. Okay. And if you write a new constitution that prohibits slavery and you have at least 10% of your population, the support of 10% of your population, we can take you back. It's a good deal, in other words. So we don't need the overwhelming majority, again, of the people of your state to want to come back. You just need at least a 10%. It's called the 10% plan. It was actually Louisiana that was already moving into this motion. The state of Louisiana, we're going to see that there were Unionists there that were meeting in the city of New Orleans for the purpose of creating a new constitution, a new government, and they wanted to rejoin the Union under the 10% plan. But unfortunately, President Lincoln dies in 1865, and that plan, of course, was discarded, and Louisiana will have to wait, to be readmitted because Lincoln, again, died in office. So now we're going to see the vice president, Andrew Johnson, coming into office after Lincoln's death, and he's going to likewise take the lead of Reconstruction. He's going to now also become the leader of Reconstruction. So this is part of presidential Reconstruction. President Johnson, again, is attempting to become the leader. Okay. He's going to be suggesting reforms and so on in order to bring the South as quickly as possible. And likewise, he really wanted to rush this process as well. He really wanted to speed up the process, and he was not that interested in changing the South again at all, by the way. He is from the South. He's from Tennessee. Lincoln's vice president was actually a Southerner from Tennessee. Lincoln chose him as his running mate precisely to have a connection again with the South, with the Democrats, because Johnson was indeed a Democrat, but he was a Unionist Democrat. He was in favor of the Union. So he was brought into Lincoln's second term to serve as the vice president. He's from Tennessee. He's a Unionist Democrat, but he is in a Republican administration. Okay, now that he becomes president, he is serving as a Republican because Lincoln is from the Republican Party. But he's from the South, so he was raised in the South. He comes from the Southern society, from Southern culture, and so he's going to be very lenient, very sympathetic towards the Southern cause. Not that he favored slavery, he did not, but he's not really, he doesn't want to push the South too much to change, to reform it, to totally transform Southern society, He's going to, for example, reject this radical vision of Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner of a interracial democracy. He just doesn't see it happening. So he comes from the South, and he knows that Southerners are not going to allow, of course, the coexistence of all the races and etc. That racial equality, for example, that this is not happening anytime soon. Maybe in the distant future, but not in our generation, he said, of course. So he rejects that. In other words, there's no need to create an interracial democracy in the South because that's not going to happen, of course, he said. And so therefore, he was very lenient towards the South. He only required that the Southern states ratify the 13th Amendment. In other words, as long as you acknowledge the abolition of slavery, because this is illegal in the United States and you make it illegal in your state constitution, that's the only thing that we require. That, again, he pretty much lowered the bar, to, just make it so easy to just join back the Union. Okay, so you don't need to provide public education. You don't need to distribute land or give the freedman land or anything like that whatsoever. Okay, and he also allowed for the temporary restoration of ex-Confederates in power. In other words, that the same people that voted for secession in the state congresses, like in Texas, for example, there were many officials that voted in favor of secession, members of the Democratic Party, and that they were in office, really coordinating the war effort against the Union, that those individuals were allowed to come back to take their posts. They were still ruling the towns, they were in the state congresses in many cases. Many of them were judges, some of them were governors and the like. Again, so this is, again, a situation that was unacceptable by many Southerners, by many Northerners, by the Republican Party, by the way. But Andrew Johnson was simply letting it pass. Again, he was really, she was so lenient, in other words, that he was also issuing pardons, thousands of pardons to the ex-Confederates as well. Not only reducing sentences of many who had gone to jail for treason, but in many cases releasing them from jail, pardoning them, in other words, in the process. So so what that meant is that the ex-Confederates saw in Johnson, a man that was going to simply give them green light to preserve the old social system. In other words, that yes, the only thing that we have to do is just free the slaves, but that's about it. We don't have to change anything. Okay, after that. So again, this is something that made them feel at ease that they could indeed, pretty much create their own policies, be in control of their own states, and pretty much continue with things as usual, business as usual. Okay. And within Texas itself, again, Texas under Johnson, we're going to see that the governor of Texas was actually appointed by Andrew Johnson. Okay. Andrew Johnson actually appointed a ex-Confederate, by the way, official, to be the governor, Andrew Jackson Hamilton, that was his name, okay, to be the governor of Texas. So what that meant is that there will be no significant change in Texas as long as the Confederates are, controlling the politics. Like, for example, the governor, who, by the way, was appointed by the president, by the way. So he was, of course, an individual who was not necessarily trying to secede from the Union. He was more of in fact, he was actually trying to join the Union. Okay. But once again, those are not individuals that are trying to change Southern society. They're not trying to create, again, a society that will be totally like a multiracial society of any kind. Those were simply people that really wanted to join the Union, that is to say. It was called radical unionist, that is to say. Okay, so as a governor, that he really presented himself as a radical unionist because he wanted to move Texas as quickly as possible back into the United States. And once again, what the governor, again, is going to do, Hamilton, is that he's going to convene a constitutional convention. In other words, let's create a constitutional convention in 1866 to write a constitution for Texas, so the new Texas Constitution can be used to present it again to the United States as proof that we are now ready to be accepted. We are creating the changes that that the president requires, President Johnson. Remember that he was just lenient. So again, in this Texas Constitution, Texas declares secession and slavery legal. Okay. In other words, look, yes, we ratified the 13th Amendment. Now, Texas hereby declares slavery and secession to be illegal. Okay, seceding from the Union is illegal, and also slavery is illegal. So the Constitution states it very, very clearly, and it granted certain economic rights to blacks in this case, in terms of allowing them to buy land, for example, to engage in commercial transactions and the like, to be employed, in different sectors of the economy, to participate in that fashion. But it denied civil rights. In other words, like the right to vote, the right to hold office. Again. So Hamilton, once again, despite the fact that he's, a unionist, he's not, again, endorsing the radical vision, this radical Republican vision, again, that he wants to transform Texas society so radically that he wants to give birth to a whole new society. So the evidence is that in the Constitution, again, blacks cannot participate, again, in politics. Again, they cannot vote, they cannot hold office. Again, so this is a kind of halfway, if you will, measure. Okay, a halfway measure. But despite that fact that it was halfway measure, there were, conservative Democrats that saw that as too radical. Even for them, they saw that Hamilton was not necessarily the ideal governor because he was still providing room, again, for change. That is to say, that he was indeed creating some change. So they thought he was just too liberal for them. And there's still a lot of conservative Democrats. They were the previously ex-Confederates, fire eaters, that favored secession, by the way, more passionately than Hamilton. And again, they're going to now try to seize the governorship again and elect a more conservative Democrat in order to prevent Texas from changing. As a matter of fact, and if possible, to backtrack some of the changes that Hamilton had allowed to create. There were not a lot of changes to speak of, but again, the conservative Democrats really want to now preserve the old order. In other words, before the Civil War, Texas existed in an ideal way, so we need to go back to that ideal way, that is to say. And because Johnson is in office, there's room to do that again. So Johnson is not really trying to prevent the ex-Confederates, prevent Democrats from holding office in the South. He's pretty much allowing them to do that, to be in control of their own states. So it is in Texas that we're going to see the election of a new governor, Throckmorton. That was his last name, Throckmorton. That is coming from this highly conservative Democratic Party background. Okay, and he will be elected again as governor, and he is going to really push Texas as further back as possible to the type of society, the type of social order, again, before the Civil War. He was far more passionate for what is called states' rights, the rights of the states. Again, this is something that southern states are going to invoke from time to time. This is, again, a philosophy, what's called states' rights, that really go back, again, to the 1830s, when the Southerners saw abolition of slavery coming. And they began to invoke the idea of states' rights to indicate that the southern states had certain rights like life, liberty, and property. And that meant the right to retain their property, their slaves, that is to say. So states' rights have always, for one reason or another in the United States, been associated with the issue of slavery, in other words. And after the Civil War, because slavery is being abolished, states' rights is going to be used by the South in order to prevent blacks or African Americans from participating again in politics. So again, this is going to be another tool, if you will, another mechanism to invoke the rights of the states to shape their own destinies, to control their own local affairs. The states have that right, in other words. And so because Texas is now in the hands of highly conservative politicians from the Democratic Party, they want minimum change, okay, to take place, minimum change or no change whatsoever. And again, the governor, the new governor, Throckmorton, again, is going to allow the ex-Confederates back in power. So they're back in power pretty much in Texas. Texas is now being controlled through and through, again, by the ex-Confederates. And this is going to be, again, leading Texas to clash more and more, again, with the Union forces that were still stationed in Texas. There will be now a new kind of warfare against the Union Army under this governor, again, Throckmorton, in that there will be guerrilla warfare against the Union Army. Guerrilla warfare is hit and run tactics. Hit and run, you hit and you run, etc. You hide. And again, the Union Army is going to be ambushed or attacked constantly from time to time at night, for example, and so on. Again, so it's going to be like making life very difficult for the Union forces, because, again, the very conservative, the secessionists, the fire eaters are now back in power. Okay, they're going to reject the Freemen Bureau, this agency that the radical Republicans created to protect blacks and the freedmen, in other words, in the South. They're rejecting, again, completely this agency because they understand what the agency does, and they often label them as carpetbaggers. A carpetbagger is any individual that comes from another state. He's a foreigner, in other words, that just grab his bags, in other words, his luggage and move into another state as an opportunist. In other words, to make money, to make deals, to make corrupt bargains and so on, because there's an opportunity to loot and plunder another state. So many, this is, again, a term that will be used from time to time by Southerners to label the Northerners that are coming into the South to aid the process of Reconstruction. They're called carpetbaggers, okay, corrupt. Also, planters delayed emancipation under this governor. The plantation owner did not feel the need. They were not pressured necessarily to free their slaves, and they just delayed it. They were just holding on to their slaves, and as long as they were not pressured, they were not to comply with the emancipation, process. And because the Freemen Bureau is being harassed and attacked constantly, the Freemen Bureau is not really paying attention totally to every region, every plantation of Texas. And of course, there will be slaves that are escaping, by the way. There will be slaves that are emancipating themselves. They're freeing themselves and they're running away. And during this particular transition period, when the Democrats, the conservative Democrats are in power, there will be also persecution of escaped slaves as well. They're considered to be runaways, even though slavery is now abolished, of course, even under the Texas Constitution, but nonetheless, they're still treated as slaves, and if they run away, they're being persecuted as well. So again, this is the situation, once again, in Texas. Also, under this governor in Texas, Throckmorton, we're going to see the creation of the black codes again. And Texas allow for the creation of codes or laws, state laws, that were nicknamed as black codes, such as, for example, the vagrancy laws. Okay, so what is a vagrancy law? A vagrancy law is simply a law that prohibits um, blacks from roaming around in the countryside or roaming around from town to town without a job. Okay, that it is prohibited for them to be simply moving from place to place without employment, without a job. So under the vagrancy laws, people that were actually doing that, they were actually arrested. And in order to free themselves, to gain their freedom, they needed to sign, of course, a contract to be employed. In other words, look, if we're going to give you employment, because that's the only way you can be liberated. In other words, you have to have a residence, you have to have employment, you have to be productive, and there's a lot of employers, in other words. So by signing a labor contract, now you're going to be paid a wage, in other words, if you work for this particular individual. And so they were given jobs, if you will, in order to prevent them from actually, again, be roaming the countryside, going from place to place, that is to say. Okay, so those, again, are the black codes, the first black codes that we're going to see. That, of course, the Democrats that are back in power in the South, in Texas, allow that to happen, of course. And the aim, of course, of the vagrancy laws was simply to preserve the system of labor. It's not slavery anymore, but plantation owners wanted to preserve their system of labor in one way or another. They said, "Wait, we're going to do away with slavery. In other words, we're not going to own, people anymore, but we're going to pay them a wage." Okay, so we need labor because we need to produce cotton, and under the vagrancy laws, that facilitated, again, the ability of the Southern planters to acquire, again, more and more labor under a wage system, a system of wages, if you will. Okay. So again, this is going to create a backlash against Johnson. Johnson is going to actually be held responsible for what is happening in the South, what is happening in Texas. Okay. Because the Republican Party is witnessing this situation and is not really, happy, again, with Johnson's Reconstruction. In other words, you are the leader of Reconstruction, but you're just simply allowing the South to go back to business in a way. Again, the slaves are not totally emancipated. Many of them are actually forced to sign labor contracts with their former masters, etc. So what are we doing here? We need to reform Southern society. The South is never going to change when the conservative Democrats are in office, in other words. So again, this is going to lead to the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson will be impeached because he started confronting, battling the Republicans in Congress again. So Republicans in Congress really wanted change in the South. And as soon as Congress, the Republicans in Congress began to pass laws to actually force the South to change, Andrew Johnson began to block any attempt, any law, any bill emanating from Congress that was aiming to change, to force change in the South. That is to say, for example, number one, in 1866, Johnson vetoed the extension of the Freedmen's Bureau. Congress said we're going to have to actually extend the lifetime of the Freedmen's Bureau. It has to be renewed, and we hereby renew the Freedmen's Bureau. We think this is vital, to carry out Reconstruction in the South. And he came out saying that this was an unnecessary agency, that it was not really helping with the process, that it was taking so much finances, from the administration. He vetoed without, again, any logic behind it other than we just don't need it, in other words. So that was the first, again, instance of how he started to block Reconstruction from Congress. He also vetoed the Civil Rights Act passed by Congress in 1866 that was attempting, under the Civil Rights Act, grant citizenship and voting rights to African Americans, of course, to blacks, to give them citizenship, civil rights, that is to say, and also voting rights. And he vetoed that act. There's no rationale, no logic behind it other than he just vetoes that act. And again, Congress is going to turn around and now pass the 14th Amendment. They said, well, what we're going to do is actually amend the Constitution, okay, in order to grant citizenship to the freedmen. So under the 14th Amendment, what it states is that any person born inside of the United States, in any of the states of the United States, or any of the territories, regardless of race and color, is citizen of the United States and enjoys all the rights and responsibilities of the Constitution. A citizen, in other words. That's the 14th Amendment. And of course, he also vetoed the 14th Amendment. But by this time, the members of Congress, they all got together and said, look, we know that he's going to veto our bills. So when we receive the veto, we can actually override the veto by a 2/3 majority on both houses, on the House of Representatives and the Senate. So if you have a majority in the House and the Senate, you can actually override the presidential veto, even though it's veto. You can actually override it, and that's exactly what Congress is now doing, is overriding Johnson's veto. Okay, in the same year, Congress passed another bill creating a new Freemen Bureau. Okay, they created a new one. They said this is going to extend for a period of time into the future, not just 1 year, and so on. And in this case, Johnson understood that there was nothing to be done here because Congress was simply going to move forward with this bill. But what he did instead is that he removed all of the appointments of Congress, all of the people that were appointed into the Bureau. He actually fired them and replaced them with Southerners. Okay, Southerners were to lead the Freedmen's Bureau. So, of course, they're not going to comply. If this institution is to protect the freedman from Southerners, but Southerners are the one in charge, so nothing will get done. Again, the whole purpose of the agency will be totally discarded. It was totally useless, of course. So again, this led to finally, again, the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. Congress just had enough. They said, this is just enough. We have to impeach Andrew Johnson. And he was impeached in the House. But when the vote was taken in the Senate to decide whether to remove him or not, he fell short of just one vote from being removed, in other words. So he was impeached, but he was not removed. Again, because the Senate, did not have the majority of the votes to remove him. But it was clear that he was now being given a warning. In other words, look, you have to step aside, all right? Because if you continue blocking Reconstruction, we're simply going to remove you from office. But this is just a warning, in other words. It's a warning that you have to, again, stay, step aside again and allow Congress now to take the lead. And that's exactly what happens again. We're now going to see congressional Reconstruction, but Congress is not just taking the lead of Reconstruction, but the impeachment of Johnson actually radicalized, Congress. It radicalized Republicans, in that radical Republicans are not just a tiny minority of within this party, but rather the vast majority of the Republicans in office in Congress. They are now sharing this radical vision, again, of Stevens and Sumner, in that it is true. If we are to rebuild the United States, if we are to rebuild the South, we need radical change. Okay, we try to be lenient We just tried it with Johnson, and this is what happens. Of course, no change was created. In fact, the South went back to the old ways. In other words, so we need to press as hard as possible for change. Again, so the radical Republicans are now in charge of Reconstruction in Congress, and they're attempting to build an interracial democracy. In other words, this is our mission. We need to change the South so it can become an interracial democracy. And they passed two Reconstruction Acts. The first Reconstruction Act of 1867 was to really transform all of the territories, again, of the South into all of the states to withdraw again or remove the status again of statehood and transform all of the southern states into 5 regions, 5 military districts. Okay, so they have to rebuild from scratch, starting from a territory. So there are no states anymore. Okay, there are going to be territories now. There are going to be 5 military districts that we're going to actually divide the South. All of the ex-Confederacy, they're now divided into 5 military districts. So Texas and Louisiana, during this process of congressional reconstruction, becomes part of a military district. Okay, Louisiana and Texas. You can see there, Arkansas and Mississippi becomes another. Alabama, Georgia, and Florida, another. South Carolina and North Carolina, another. And Virginia, another. Okay. And each military district was governed by a Union General. Okay, a Union General was the one in charge of the military district. And why this is so is because this is the only way that Southerners are going to comply with the will of Congress. So the Union Generals are going to be obeying the orders of Congress directly and making sure that whatever Congress is saying has to be complied with, in other words. So that requires removing all of the ex-Confederate officials. So what the Union generals in those military districts are going to do is, in many cases, remove all of those conservative Democrats from office, okay, to allow for change to take place. And one of the changes is, if you wanted to acquire the status of a state, you need to write a new constitution. You need to write a Republican constitution, okay? And in those constitutions, you're not going to allow the ex-Confederates, the people that were actually responsible for secession, that voted for secession, that led the Confederacy to vote or hold office. You're going to disfranchise them, in other words. They're not going to have any political rights, that is to say. So again, this is a very radical, measure, radical change. Again, in Texas, we're talking about anywhere between 7,000 to 10,000 ex-Confederates were disfranchised. In other words, those were about 10,000 people that could not participate in the political decisions of Texas because they were associated with the Confederacy, that is to say. So they're totally removed again from the process of reform. They're not going to be blocking again Reconstruction. They need to ratify the 14th Amendment as well. Again, it's not just that their constitutions are going to abolish slavery. They have to grant also citizenship rights to the freedman as well. Citizenship to all people born in the U.S. regardless of race and color. Okay, they need to ratify the 14th Amendment as well. This is essential. They cannot be brought back to the Union without ratifying the 14th Amendment. Okay, civil rights, that is to say. We got also, again, a second Reconstruction Act also coming in the same year from Congress. Congress passes the second legislation, again, called the Second Reconstruction Act, actually enforcing voting rights for blacks. Again, military enforcement of black voting. and voting rights and voter registration. Wanted to make sure that, again, the freed population are registered to vote and that they're going to be voting in the coming elections as well. In Texas, again, the military commander for the Texas district was General Sheridan, and he's going to be the one enforcing all of those laws. Again, complying, making sure that Texas was complying again with those measures, the Second Reconstruction Act, the enforcing black voting, for example, or making sure that Texas was going to comply with the 14th Amendment as well, again, and removing the ex-Confederates from office, etc. Okay. And also the 15th Amendment. Congress amends the Constitution once again. It's called the 15th Amendment, the universal male suffrage. So to make sure that the southern states were going to allow the freedmen the right to vote, now the U.S. Constitution is amended once again, and it says that all males, again, universal male suffrage, again, regardless of race and color, have the right to vote. So likewise, in the South, this has to be obeyed as well, because this is what the U.S. Constitution said. And once again, Texas will have to write a constitution that also ratifies the 15th Amendment as well. So this is not just what the general is complying with, General Sheridan, but that if you want to come back to the Union, again, you need to ratify the 15th Amendment. Again, guarantee the right to vote. Again, universal male suffrage, again, regardless of race and color. Okay, so this is going to lead to the rise of the Republican Party in Texas, because now there's room for the Republicans to organize and to come out and participate in politics, win elections. They're going to have the support of the Unionists in Texas, particularly, again, the Unionists. There's going to be Democrats that are going to, again, they're going to be sympathetic toward this party, particularly the Unionists. There's Texas Unionists. In this case, there's radical Republicans as well that are going to become part of this emerging Republican Party. This is the first time we're going to see a Republican Party in Texas, and it's been organized in Houston. Again, in the city of Houston, we see the rise of the Texas Republicans again. So this is the first time that there's going to be a Republican Party. Again, I emphasize once again, this is the first time that there's going to be a Republican Party in the South, not just in Texas, but across the South. We're going to see the rise of the Republican Party. But in Texas, we're seeing that it is in Houston that this is being, again, organized by a biracial coalition of Texas Unionists and radical Republicans. And they're going to make an alliance with black abolitionists. Again, they're going to be black abolitionist voters, people that were voting for abolishing slavery, emancipating the slaves. That's what they were voting for. This is what they want the Republican Party to be doing. And they're going to be also electing, of course, officials that are endorsing those views of emancipation, for example, trying to provide voting rights to the freedmen as well. And some blacks will be actually elected as Republicans into political office. So again, this is unprecedented that in the South, again, that African Americans are going to actually, again, become or hold political office. Again, it is the Republican Party that is providing that outlet, if you will, because this is the party of Lincoln that abolished slavery, that won the Civil War, and now is in hold of the South, trying to reform the South, trying to rebuild it in a more profound, more radical way. Again, the purpose of the Republican Party in the South, like in Texas, was precisely to try to create the necessary change to build this interracial democracy and provide for civil rights, again, to to blacks as well. Okay, so this is again leading to more and more change, particularly when General Sheridan appoints about 500 Republican officials in different positions again of Texas levels, different levels of Texas government, from the city government again to state legislatures and beyond again. So the Republicans are now in charge of Texas. General Sheridan is helping the Republican Party grow by appointing 500 officials in office, and of course, leading to the writing of a new constitution, the Constitution of 1869. In 1869, Texas is going to write a new constitution. Yeah, that will be radically different from the Constitution of 1867 that we saw, of course, under Johnson. Okay, quite different. Okay, so in what way? Okay, in what way is this Constitution going to be different? Well, this is going to be a more beneficial, if you will, to the freed population. It provided actually civil rights for blacks. Okay, civil rights, citizenship, voting rights, for example, the rights to hold office, etc., are there in this Constitution. We saw under this Constitution 50,000 again blacks being registered to vote. Okay, again 50,000. Okay, it's a great number. From of course coming from this process of slavery again in just a few years prior to this. Of course, this is a radical change, so that's why it's called radical reconstruction. Radical change is taking place here in Texas. It created a public education system, likewise to educate the population, but also to educate the black population as well. Okay. It granted the governor the power to appoint officials and judges. So the governor acquired significant authority, and it was a Republican governor once again. And it really again, this is going to leave a scar. We're going to see, of course, down the line, how many Southerners resented the fact that when the Republicans were in office during Radical Reconstruction, they were just pushing for so much change so rapidly that Southerners just again felt that was tyrannical. In other words, that the exercise of authority, the exercise of power that those Republican officials exercise was just way too much again, but because they were pressing for so much radical change, that is to say. And also that it barred railroads and corporations from actually seizing land grants as well. So it had a component there to try to protect the farmers of Texas from the seizures of lands, again, from large corporations like railroads, for example. At any rate, so now let's move into a next and unavoidable again chapter here that deals with the reaction to radical reconstruction. I just mentioned again a few seconds ago that Southerners felt that the exercise of authority by the Republican officials and the changes that they were creating in society, allowing the right to vote to blacks, for example, allowing them to hold office, creating public education systems and the like, which were rather gradual. I mean, these were gradual changes, but from the perspective of the South, those were radical, drastic changes taking place before their eyes. Given the fact that just years before, if you think about it, their lives was so radically different from what they are right now. Okay, so before 1860, society in Texas and across the South was, pretty much dominated by planters, by large landowners, for example, that actually use slaves to produce crops, to do all the work, so social relationships, again, were very well structured, well cemented in the southern states, in which, again, there was a social order, if you will, that was almost unshakable. again, in which there was a specific group that was the dominant group, again, the planter class, and of course the slaves. And there was also, again, the small farmers that were also, again, in charge of their own lives. But all of that world, it has turned upside down. They have been defeated by the Civil War, by the Union. Now the emancipation of millions of slaves. In Texas, there were, again, hundreds of thousands of slaves, and 50,000 of them are registered to vote. Many of them are actually voting. And now the party of the North, the Republican Party, is the party that rules the South. Okay, the Democratic Party, the party of the South, is ousted. They're totally out of power. So this is drastic, radical change that, of course, not a lot of people accepted that change. Okay. And so there's going to be, of course, a reaction to that change. And again, across the South, as in Texas, again, particularly, again, this is a Texas history course. So again, this is pretty much indicative of what the whole South was going through if you just study Texas, is that we're going to see that in that reaction came from an organized, of course, violence. Okay, there's going to be a group, an organization, the KKK again, that was made up of actually ex-Confederate soldiers, ex-Confederate officials, political officials that began to pretty much create their own society, in other words, known as the KKK. Again, and the whole aim of the KKK is to restore the Democratic Party into power in the South. Like in Texas, for example, they want to remove the Republican Party so the Democratic Party can come back, of course, and regain the leadership of the South. And they use intimidation, they use violence against black voters, for example. That was, rather common, and also attack, black communities and gatherings. There were incidents in Texas, by the way, of such incidences as well. And they were also trying to enforce the black codes, what's called the vagrancy laws, trying to actually remove, again, the people roaming in the countryside, in the streets, in the towns, so they can find employment or to send them to learn a trade. Another black code was the apprentice laws. The apprentice laws was simply, again, laws that will train an individual to actually learn a trade, to teach them a trade so they can be useful or they can actually be hired somewhere, doing something like carpentry, for example, blacksmiths, etc. Again, so this is another function of the KKK, again, in the South. So, of course, there is opposition to Reconstruction. This is what the Southern reaction was. Again, it was endemic, it was pervasive, it was not just confined to a specific state, it was pervasive across the South. And of course, in Texas, we see that again quite evidently with the way that the ex-Confederates were organizing, staging violence and so on, and raiding communities and the like. The same was happening in Mississippi, the same was happening in Louisiana, etc., across the Old South. Okay, the ex-Confederacy. Now, we're now moving into the end of Reconstruction, the end of Reconstruction itself. Okay, so what brought the end of Reconstruction? Okay, so I'm going to list about 5 different reasons why Reconstruction came to an end. Number 1 is that across the United States, people in the country, that's it in Texas, by the way, but all over the country, people began to lose interest in Reconstruction due to an economic depression that hit the country. It started, going back to 1870. There were problems dealing with the countryside, with farmers. Grain prices were falling very dramatically. And by 1873, there was an economic depression that also affected the industrial sector of the United States in the Northeast. Again, also dealing with overproduction, falling prices, and foreclosures and the like. So obviously, with rising unemployment, 12% unemployment, the priorities of the country began to change. People are now thinking about the economy more so than Reconstruction. Prior to 1870, 1873, of course, the priority is Reconstruction. This is what politicians are talking about and doing. But by 1873, the conversation is changing. People want to talk about the economy. In other words, this is what we need to do. So again, this is the first stepping stone to end Reconstruction. The loss of interest, if you will, in this process by Americans. And so the Republican Party, of course, because it was holding office during this time of the economic depression, got blamed for the depression. So this is just, again, a kind of natural response to crises, is that whenever there's a crisis, the party in office is the one that gets the blame, again, for the crisis. So because Republicans were in charge of Reconstruction, Republicans became very discredited, in that whenever they talked about Reconstruction, people just did not want to hear about it because they just felt that Republicans, they abandoned the economy. They did not take care of the economy precisely because there was so much involved in the South, and now people don't have trust. They don't trust the Republican Party again. So the Republicans, which were the leaders of Reconstruction, are losing a lot of support as well. And so the loss of support translated with also the loss of support for the cause of Reconstruction. Okay. So number three, of course, in Texas itself, we're going to see that the process of Reconstruction was now coming to an end when, in 1874, the Democrats actually nominated a staunch conservative Democrat to the governorship. There were elections to elect a governor in 1874, and they actually elected an ex-Confederate known as the Redeemer of Texas, Richard Koch. Again, Richard Koch. Ex-Confederate. And what I mean Redeemer is that he was going to really remove the burden of Reconstruction. He was going to save Texas from the Republicans, and he's going to backtrack all of the changes that the Republicans have created in Texas, that is to say. So just the fact that, Texas is now once again governed by the ex-Confederates in 1874, just that fact alone is going to signal the end of Reconstruction in Texas. People in Texas just interpret that it's just a matter of time when this process is going to come to an end. And in the following year, most of the South was also redeemed, the redemption of the South. When in 1875, there were a series of elections. In 1875, 76, Louisiana, for example, Mississippi, Virginia, Georgia, they were to elect also their governors, and they implemented a strategy called the Mississippi Plan, because it was first implemented by Mississippi, and the plan to regain the governorship back, so they can remove the Republicans and reinstall the Democrats. That plan involved actually preventing Republicans from voting, the Mississippi Plan. So they simply sent people to the voting booth. There's a lot of people that were sent, again, to those districts to prevent, again, Republican voters from actually accessing the ballot, period. And by doing so, they made sure that the Democrats were, were back in office. So it worked so well in Mississippi that plan was actually implemented across the South as well. So by 1877, the entire South was redeemed. In other words, it was once again in the hands of the Democrats, once again. and the Republicans had lost total control of the South. So there was no way that those Democratic officials were going to push the South towards change. They were there to actually prevent change. So the last actually factor that brought Reconstruction is actually a compromise that was elaborated by the North and the South after the presidential election of 1877. Okay, that ended Reconstruction. Again, the Great Compromise of 1877 ended Reconstruction, and that really was a compromise that saved the Union from another crisis, because the presidential elections of 1877 were to tear the country apart once again, just like Lincoln's election back in 1860. Because now, in 1877, in the country, people wanted change. This was a change election, and people really wanted now to try the Democrats once again, to try to solve the problem of the economy. And Samuel Tilden, the Democrat from the South, was very charismatic, very popular. He was so popular that even Northerners were going to vote for him again. So he had also some support in the North, and he was quite sure that he was actually going to win. And Rutherford Hayes, the Republican, represented the interest of the North, and he had not a lot of backing, by the way. But at the end of the election, those two candidates ended up with very tight numbers, that they had to count, the votes several times in places like Louisiana and Florida, okay, several times to make sure, who was the winner again. And ultimately, that did not solve the situation, because both parties claimed victory, both of them, at the end of the day, despite the fact that they were recounting the votes. So this threatened the stability, the fabric of the Union once again. It was to be totally shattered once again because of this presidential election. But a compromise was reached. And the compromise was reached between the Democrats and the Republicans, called the Compromise of 1877, the Great Compromise. And what the Great Compromise was is that Southern Democrats, Samuel Tilden and Southern Democrats were willing to cede the election to the Republicans with some conditions. In other words, look, we let you win. Okay, we're willing to come out and say that you are the winner. Hayes, the Republican, won the election if we end Reconstruction once and for all. In other words, don't press us to change anymore. We want all of the states to be simply reunited back into the Union with no further change whatsoever. Withdraw the last federal troops from the South and build a new railroad in the South. So if you give us that, okay, if you finish Reconstruction, if we are readmitted back as we are, okay, with no further change, and if you remove the last federal troops and build us a railroad, we got a deal, in other words. And they had the deal, okay? And so that really brought the end to Reconstruction. Again, there will be no further change to take place in the South, okay? The end result is the readmission of all the southern states back into the Union. Texas was readmitted back into the Union, and a new constitution was written, by the way, in 1876. A new constitution that will be consistent with the ideals, with the requirements, again, of the North. A Republican constitution. Again, this is a new Republican constitution that abolished all titles of nobility. Nobody was going to be enjoying privileges, for example, like owning slaves, for example, the landlord with entitlements to property like slaves, for example. Again, it ratified the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery, the 14th Amendment, granting citizenship to the freedman, and 15th Amendment, the right to vote. Okay, so again, even though it provided male suffrage, again, it did provide male suffrage. What we're going to see is that also this constitution kind of make provisions for a poll tax. Like, we're not going to deny you the right to vote, but you have to pay to vote. And it's expensive, by the way. A whole week worth of earnings you have to pay just to vote. So again, that disincentivizes, people with low incomes, of course, from voting, because that was so expensive. By the way, it nonetheless prohibited bank charters, the creation of banks, for example, under that constitution. The state was given the powers to regulate businesses and corporations, and also the governor, again, under this constitution, was largely diminished and disempowered. It was just a figurehead with no significant authority to enforce, the law necessarily. Okay, so again, why Texas decided to create a very weak, governor. Because of Reconstruction. They're going back to Reconstruction, and they saw that during Reconstruction, the governor exercised undue powers that were tyrannical, because they enforced change upon the people of Texas. And in order to avoid that in the future, again, they created a constitution that really rendered the governor pretty much like a figurehead, just that's a symbolic figure. That is to say, okay. So at any rate, those are the key terms. Again, the origins and the causes of the Civil War is one term. We saw that in the first session. Confederate Texas in the Civil War, that is in the second session, and Texas during Reconstruction is in this third session. This is the end again of our sixth topic of the semester, dealing with Texas from Civil Wars to Reconstruction. This is the end again of this sixth topic. And after this, we're going to be moving into the last three topics again of the semester when we return. Thank you.